Hi, I'm Erin and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favorite series of all time as of January 2021. So I decided to keep this list to just completed series. I have a lot of series I want to call favorites, but they're not completed, so who knows how they could end. And so I also feel very confident in my number 1 and 2 and my 8 through 10, but 3 through 7 are kind of all equal. So with that being said, let's get started with number 10. Number 10 is the Kingmaker, Kingbreaker universe by Karen Miller. This universe has a duology, a sequel duology, and a prequel standalone. The first duology is set in the world of Lure, where there is a ruling class who has magic, and the other class who is not allowed to use magic. And I'm going to say it right now, if you're looking for a fantasy that pushes the boundary of fantasy, that brings new things to the genre, this is not the series for you. This is very much a run-of-the-mill, chosen one prophecy trope fantasy, which is not to say it's bad, but definitely just kind of your standard fantasy, and I really enjoyed it. The first duology follows a boy named Asher who moves from his coastal village to the capital city to earn money for his family, and he meets and befriends the prince, which kind of helps him with social standing as well as money. And follows his adventures as well as this prophecy about the chosen one of the non-magic class who's going to save them all. The sequel duology follows the kids of some of the main characters of the first duology, and then the prequel book is the reason the series is on the list, as the other 4 books were all solid 4 stars, but the prequel book was 5 stars, one of my favorite single fantasy books of all time. And in the world of the 4 books, there's these 2 legendary mages, and they're kind of like the legend and lore of the worlds is kind of revolving around their story, and the prequel book tells their story, and I love the prequel book. It's so good. I'm wanting to reread it because it's been a couple years since I've read it. So if you're looking for kind of a nice comfort fantasy series, I would put that in that category. So number 9 is the His Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman. This is my bind-up edition. There's 3 books in this series: The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass. I first read this series when I was in, I think, 4th grade and loved it. I recently reread it because the BBC HBO has a adaptation, and I reread it in between seasons 1 and 2 because I remember book 1 really well, but not book 2 and 3, and I wanted to refresh my mind before watching season 2. This takes place in an alternate Earth, mostly in Britain and the northern Nordic countries, where humans have demons, which are animals that are kind of an extension of their soul that travel with them. When you're young, your demon can change shapes, and then around puberty, they settle into one shape. And there's also magic and witches in this series. And we follow Lyra, who is 12, and she is an orphan she's an orphan being raised by Jordan College, and she kind of goes off on an adventure to save her friend who gets taken by these child snatchers. And there's also a bigger story in this book about kind of the magisterium, which is this church stand-in, and there's definitely a lot of anti-church and anti-God messages in this book. I remember when I read it in 4th grade, my parents were pretty chill, so they didn't care that I read it, but I had a lot of friends that weren't allowed to read it. As a 4th grader, it kind of all went over my head. As an adult, it's just like a really interesting metaphor. I definitely recommend it. I think they're really good. I had two webkins in 4th grade that I named after characters from this book, one of them being a polar bear and the other being a leopard. So this has been a long time favorite. The adaptation is also really good, so I definitely recommend them. Number 8 on this list is The Arc of the Size Trilogy by Neil Shusterman. This is a 3-book series. This is set in a dystopian U.S. based setting where humanity has discovered immortality, but in order to keep population under control, they have the Scythe organization exists, and they glean or kill people based on some like guidelines they have to keep population under control because people are still having kids, but they aren't dying. And so this follows 2 apprentice Scythes who are late teenagers who apprentice to a scythe to learn how to become a scythe. And there's a lot of plot unfolding, and the first 2 were amazing, 5 stars. The 3rd one was only 4 stars, so I know a lot of people were more disappointed in it than I was, but I still think it's good enough to make this list. I love the first two. I'm a big Neil Shusterman fan in general, so definitely recommend these and his other things. Number 7 on my list, and I only have one of the books with me to hold up, is the Codex Alera series by Jim Butcher. This is the first book, Furies of Calderon, but there are 6 in total. This book is about a world called Alera, and where people bond with elemental spirit creatures called Furies. And this series was inspired when someone asked the author, Jim Butcher, what would happen if you cross Pokemon with Roman legions, which I'm not really a Pokemon fan, so that part, I learned that after I read the book, and that probably would not have enticed me to read it. And also, I don't consider myself a big military fantasy fan because I don't like reading fight scenes, but this series really worked for me despite all that. In the first book, we're following Tavi, who doesn't have a Fury of his own bonded, and he's at an age in which he should. And so the first book is largely regarded as the weakest, but I still think it's good. So book 2 is personally my favorite because I'm a big fan of a school setting. But so we follow Tabby from youth in this one up as he gets schooled and gets older. And there's 6 books in total, and I really like the series. This is Jim Butcher's lesser known series. Everyone knows him for Dresden Files, but I love these and think more people should read these. Okay, Number 6 on my list is the Books of Amba series by Tasha Suri, which is a duology, Empire of Sand and Realm of Ash. Empire of Sand takes place in a world they both take place in a world inspired by Mughal India, and there's about these people called the Amrithi who are nomadic outcasts and who can do magic like with desert spirits. Our main character, Umair, is the illegitimate daughter of an imperial governor and an Amrithi mother, so she inherits some of her mother's magic. And when this magic becomes known to the world, because it was being kept secret, she's taken away by mystics because of it. And so both of these books, and then this book follows Umair's sister 10 years later. And so both of these books have some of the best, most well-written romances in fantasy that I have ever read, which is largely why they're on this list. They're slow burn, respectful romances that were just so good. The magic systems in both of these are also pretty interesting, as well as the world was different from anything I'd read. So overall, definitely recommend these if any of that sounds good to you, and I'm excited to read more by this author. Number 5 on this list is Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. If you're watching this video, you've probably heard of these, but in case you haven't, this is set in a world where the bad guy won, and they're kind of living in the aftermath, and we follow our main character, Vin, who's a street urchin, who has the power of allomancy, which is the magic system in these books where metals give you different kinds of powers. I really love these books. I thought the ending of the series was amazing. I really liked Vin, our main character. I liked a lot of all these side characters too. These were one of the first books series I read kind of in high school when I was moving from mostly YA to reading more adult fantasy, so I definitely recommend them if you're a newer fantasy reader. And I'm a big fan of Brandon Sanderson. So number 4 on this list is the Greatcoats series by Sebastian de Castell. This is a 4-book series that's a swashbuckling fantasy adventure, kind of in the vein of The Three Musketeers meets more modern fantasy. And I thought these were just so fun. I started reading them as part of Mike's Books Reviews read-along last year, and I'm so glad I picked them up. These are just compulsively readable good times. Like, that's just, like, they're not perfect. They have flaws. Book 1 especially has some flaws. I know a lot of people weren't big fans of Book 3, and it wasn't my favorite of the 4, but I still thought it was good. And they're just so fun. I love the our main trio of Falkio, Kest, and Brasti are hilarious. I love their interactions. I think the storyline is just so fast-paced and fun. It takes place in this world following these 3 characters who are Greatcoats, which were formerly the king's kind of bringers of justice, like traveling judges, I guess. But the king has died, and I think it's about 5 years after the king has died is when the first one starts. And they're still trying to go around now, trying to figure out what to do, because with no king, there's no formal Greatcoats anymore, and there's no king's law to uphold, so they're kind of finding their way in the world. And they get pulled into a plot to establish a new ruler in this world that's currently, there's no king anymore. It's all the duchies just kind of for themselves. And they're just a good time. Number 3 on this list is the Black Magician Trilogy by Trudy Canavan. This first book starts with the magicians of Imardin, which is the land where we are, gathering in the city center to do their yearly purge of undesirables in the cities, and they are protected by a magic barrier, and one girl in the audience is able to throw a rock and pierce their barrier, which shows she has some kind of magical talent. And so the magicians are now dead set on finding her so they can train her to harness this power before she destroys herself and the city and anyone around her. I really like this trilogy. I like the main character a lot. There's also a academy. The guild is pretty much an academy training magicians, and I love school settings. And I thought this was a really fun trilogy. I'm planning on doing a reread sometime this year, I hope, because there is a sequel series that I never picked up when I first read these, and I want to reread these before picking that up so I can kind of refresh myself on some of the events of it, because it's been a few years since I read them. So definitely recommend these. Number 2 on my list is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which is The Poppy War, The Dragon Republic, and The Burning Guide. I read all of these in 2020, and I loved them. These are so good. If these are a historical inspired fantasy based on Chinese history, and we follow our main character Ren, who gets into this prestigious military academy despite being from a really poor province who usually isn't able to send people to this military academy. And when she gets there, she's training, and she's kind of an outcast because of her poor upbringing, and so it follows her as well as some of the other characters she meets at the academy, and then an ensuing war that breaks out. And I love this series. Ren is the freaking worst, and I love reading about her. Nisa and Kate, some of our side characters, are amazing. I would die for Nisa. I love him so much. The second book in the series, The Dragon Republic, is easily my favorite of the series, but all 3 were 5-star reads for me. If you have any interest in historically based fantasy, I would definitely recommend these. Fair warning, if you are unaware, these are very, very dark. Especially the first one, there's a lot of trigger warnings, so for a lot of kind of bloody, gory, awful things that happen in them, so if you might be bothered by that kind of thing, definitely maybe look those up before picking these up. But if those things don't bother you from reading a book, definitely recommend. And my number 1 favorite series of all time, and unfortunately I only have one of the books here to hold up, is The Memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan. This is actually the standalone sequel to the 5-book series, but as I said, this is the only one I have here in my apartment to hold up. And I love this series so much. The 5 books follow Lady Trent, who is the leading dragon naturalist in her world. And her world is like a Victorian era world, or Victorian era inspired alternate world. And so, based on the series name, The Memoirs of Lady Trent, you might guess that the 5 books are written like they are her memoirs, and each one catalogs a different adventure in her career as she goes from child all the way to revered scientist. And I love them. I love the Victorian world. I think it's so interesting to read. I'm a big historical fiction fan, so that's probably a factor in loving these historical inspired worlds so much. I love our main character, Lady Trent. She's so interesting. I love the lady scientist. She's such a great character. Her adventures in I like the way that each one's just a new adventure in a different world, exploring a different corner of the world, and I love them. This, as I said, is the standalone sequel that follows Lady Trent's granddaughter. I wish this was not a standalone sequel and instead her own series, because I love this one as well. All 6 of these books got 5 stars for me. Love them. If you like historical influence at all in your fantasies, definitely recommend. They're so good. They also have some of my favorite covers of all time. So anyways, those are my top 10 favorite completed series of all time as of January 2021. Now that I'm out of college and an adult, I'm reading a lot more and able to finish a lot more series, so I'll see if at the end of this year I have any new completed series to add to this list. See you next time!